No one noticed the woman in the gray house anymore. It sat at the far edge of Cottonwood Ridge, where the dirt road thinned into dust and the wind carried the smell of sage and old rain. The paint had faded to the color of tired clouds, and the porch light flickered at night like it was unsure it still belonged to the world. Folks passed it every day and never slowed down. They knew who lived there, or rather, who didn't visit her. No husband, no children, no laughter drifting through open windows. Just a woman named Eleanor Whitcomb and the quiet she had learned to live with. Eleanor had lived alone for 12 years. Not because she wanted to, not because she was cold or strange, but because life had a way of closing doors softly, one by one, until you barely noticed the sound. Her parents passed within months of each other. Her fiancé never came back from a construction job out of state. Friends moved on, built families, filled their calendars. Eleanor stayed, telling herself that staying was a kind of strength. Each morning, she rose before the sun, brewed her coffee strong, and sat at the small kitchen table where the chair across from her remained empty. She worked as the town's unofficial helper, mending hems, baking pies for funerals, watching children when emergencies came up. She smiled easily. She laughed when appropriate. But when evening fell and the sky stretched white and lonely, she returned to the gray house and the echo of her own footsteps. People said she was independent. Others said she was too quiet. A few whispered that something must be wrong with a woman who lived alone that long. Eleanor heard it all. She just never answered. 5 miles down the road lived a rancher named Thomas Hale. Thomas had land, cattle, and hands that bore the story of every hard season he'd survived. He was a widower of 8 years, raising no children, speaking little more than necessary. The town respected him, but they didn't know him well. He fixed fences himself, ate supper alone, and attended church with his hat in his hands and his head bowed low. Thomas noticed Eleanor long before he ever spoke to her. He saw her at the feed store, patiently waiting while others were served first. He saw her kneeling at the church steps, helping an elderly woman with swollen ankles. He saw her one winter evening, standing in the snow, holding a casserole dish she'd brought to a grieving neighbor, waiting until the door finally opened. She never made a show of kindness. She just did it. The first time Thomas spoke to her, it was over a broken fence line. One of his steers had wandered off during a storm and trampled part of Eleanor's back pasture. Thomas arrived the next morning, hat in hand, apology ready, prepared for anger or at least irritation. Instead, Eleanor smiled and handed him a glass of water. "Storms do strange things," she said gently. "I'm just glad the animal's safe." Thomas didn't know what to say to that. He fixed the fence anyway, working longer than necessary. Eleanor brought him a sandwich. They spoke little, but something settled quietly between them, like dust after rain. After that, Thomas found reasons to pass by the gray house. Sometimes he dropped off extra eggs. Sometimes he brought firewood. Sometimes he just waved from his truck and kept going. Eleanor never questioned it. She accepted the gestures with grace, never asking for more, never assuming anything. Weeks turned into months. They began talking, first about weather, then about land, then about loss. Eleanor told him about the life she'd expected to live. Thomas told her about the wife he'd buried beneath a cottonwood tree. There were long pauses in their conversations, but they were comfortable pauses, the kind that didn't demand filling. One spring afternoon, Eleanor didn't open the door. Thomas knocked once, then twice, then again. A worry crept into his chest that surprised him with its force. He found her in the kitchen, pale and shaking, a broken chair at her feet. She'd fallen trying to fix a cabinet hinge and had lain there for hours. "I didn't want to bother anyone," she whispered, ashamed. Thomas carried her to his truck without a word. During her recovery, he came every day. He cooked badly. He cleaned worse. He listened well. Eleanor protested, but he ignored her protests with a stubborn gentleness that made her laugh despite herself. "You don't have to do this," she told him one evening. "I know," he replied simply. "I want to." That was the moment Eleanor realized something had changed, not just between them, but inside her. The walls she'd built to survive were strong, but they were also heavy. And for the first time in years, she wondered what it might feel like to set one down. The town noticed, of course. They noticed Thomas's truck parked outside the gray house. They noticed Eleanor's laugh, lighter now, drifting through open windows. Some approved. Some gossiped. A few warned Thomas that Eleanor was set in her ways, that she'd lived alone too long to be anything else. Thomas didn't listen. What he saw was a woman who had given everything she had to the world and asked nothing in return. A woman who deserved more than survival. The unexpected turn came in the form of a letter. One morning, Eleanor received notice that the land her house stood on was being sold, an old clerical error surfacing after decades. She had 60 days to vacate. The house she'd held onto through every loss was no longer hers. Eleanor folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. She didn't cry. She'd done enough of that in her life. She packed quietly, giving away what she could, preparing herself for yet another ending. Thomas found out by accident. He arrived with fresh bread and found boxes stacked by the door. "Where are you going?" he asked. "I'm not sure," Eleanor replied honestly. Something in Thomas broke open then, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. He saw the future stretching ahead of her, alone again, carrying her strength like a burden. He saw his own life, white and empty despite all the land he owned. That night, he didn't sleep. The next morning, he stood on Eleanor's porch, hat in his hands, heart pounding harder than it ever had in a storm. "I'm not good with speeches," he said. Eleanor waited. "I don't have much to offer besides a place that could use some warmth," he continued. "And a life that's better when you're in it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and asked the question that would change them both. "Will you be my wife?" Eleanor didn't answer right away. She thought of the years alone. The nights she'd cried quietly so no one would hear. The way she'd learned to be strong because she had no choice. And she thought of the man standing before her, not rescuing her, not pitying her, but choosing her. "Yes," she said finally, tears streaming down her face. "Yes, I will." Their marriage wasn't flashy. There were no grand announcements or lavish celebrations. But the day Eleanor moved into the ranch house, sunlight filled rooms that had long known only shadow. The gray house was sold, but its spirit followed her, a reminder of where she'd been, not where she was going. Together, they built a life rooted in quiet compassion. They opened their home to foster children. They hosted Sunday dinners for anyone who needed a place. Eleanor's kindness found new ground to grow in. Thomas's silence softened into warmth. People began to understand. Love, they learned, doesn't always arrive young or loud. Sometimes it comes after years of waiting, wrapped in patience and simple words spoken from the heart. Eleanor no longer lived alone. And when she looked back on those years, she didn't see emptiness anymore, she saw preparation. A long, quiet journey that led her exactly where she was meant to be. Because sometimes, the greatest acts of compassion are not about saving someone, but about seeing them, choosing them, and saying, "You don't have to walk alone anymore."